Welcome to Inner Peace with Dr. Reese, a program that can help you become liberated in the modern world. Now, here's your host, Dr. Kevin W. Reese.
So, do you know what Zen really is? You know, it's not a slang word. It's an actual tradition. Welcome to episode number 59. Today, I'm talking to Daizan. He's a Zen Master who teaches at a Zen dojo in London. He's actually the first Englishman to go to Japan and become a Roshi in the rigorous Zenzai tradition of Zen. Over 20 years ago, he gave up a promising career as a scientist in the pharmaceutical industry, sold his house, gave all his money away, and entered a Zen monastery. In this brilliant conversation, we're going to start with one hand clapping, and then we're going to end with the original face. I've been mentioning these things on the podcast for episodes and episodes and episodes, but now we have an actual expert to talk about them and everything in between, including entering the stream. Daizan, welcome to the Inner Peace podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I can't help but have my first question be, how does someone hear one hand clapping?
Okay, well, what's the sound of two hands clapping? All right. So the world of the two hands is the world of this against that, the world of impact, of separation, of duality, of me against the world, all that kind of stuff. So when we're invited to explore the sound of one hand, we're invited to enter the world of no opposition, no conflict, the world of what's often called non-separation or non-duality. And actually my teacher, his website was, back in the day, was called notonenot2.com, because actually we don't settle in unity any more than we do in duality. There's no resting place. But nevertheless, it's a big step forward for people when they consciously become able to enter that place where there really is essentially no problem.
Right. We're creating it with our confused little minds, right?
Yeah, our survival mechanism sets us up for a sort of an orientation of me against the world, okay? And I've got to make my way through that. And that's great. It works, you know. It's we've made it this far through all these millennia. But of course, nature is quite keen on having you survive. Nature's probably quite keen on having you breed. But nature doesn't care at all about your happiness. If you want to survive and breathe and be happy, then you need a little bit extra.
You know, Zen is interesting because so many people use the term as slang now. You know, somebody who has no knowledge of the tradition will just say, don't ruin my Zen. You know, or something to that effect, like it's a slang word.
Sure.
And they don't understand that it's a whole tradition, you know, a subdivision, if you will, of Buddhism. And, you know, they don't know the story of Master Bhodhidarma and things of that nature. Do you think Zen has a chance to become more popular here in the Western world?
Well, if we look at Japan, okay, and you know, in many ways, Japan has a similar level of development to the States, to Western Europe, and so on. Now, in terms of religious culture, the biggest single religious system within Japan is called the Jodo Shin school. Jodo means pure land, and basically it's a very, very simple kind of mode of practice. Basically, what they say is, if you call the name of a Mida Buddha, the name of a particular Buddha, sincerely, even one time in your life, when you die, he'll come and, as it were, guide you on to the Pure Land, which is, it's not exactly complete liberation, but it's kind of like the next best thing. You know what I mean? Mm. So that's kind of it. So you don't need any education. It's open to rich, poor, the intelligent, the uneducated, everybody. So in other words, you could say, you know, salvation is universal. So Zen, in that context, is for that relatively small group of people who don't want to wait till their deathbed. They want to find that Pure Land, you know, and live from that place, not just sort of, as it were, die into that place. And so within that context, it's a relatively small proportion. I would say maybe 4% of the population. And I have this suspicion that whatever the system, whatever the regime, whether we're talking communism or, you know, some kind of crazy cultural revolution situation, whatever, I have this feeling that there's roughly 4% of humans who really want to do this, and they'll pretty much do this come what may, however unfavorable or favorable the circumstances are. And then the rest of, you know, the world, there are other things that they find important or more of a priority. So I kind of suspect that Zen will always be, you know, a minority occupation or a minority interest. But that's cool, because if you got 4% of your population who are really living on beam, as it were, and really, you know, as it were, manifesting that in the world, that's pretty revolutionary right there, I'd say.
Yeah. You know, Zen can be intense.
Yeah.
If we're going to use, like, say, a military analogy, you know, is it fair to say Zen is like the Navy SEALs of spirituality? I mean, I'm sure you've sat for long periods of time silent, and, you know, you're in a mindful state, even when you're, you know, when you're cooking, when you're chopping wood or whatever it is. I would imagine a lot of people come to a monastery and they're out in days. They leave because they're like, whoa.
Well, again, you know, if we look at the Japanese system, the way it's evolved, if you imagine, you know, you've got a country that's covered in temples. Every village has got 2 or 3 temples. Every little town has got 5 or 6 or more. And so these days, all those temples are run by families. And the eldest boy, when he comes of age, he gets sent off to a sort of a boot camp type experience, a sort of training monastery, which is, in a way, you can call it a monastery, but you could just as easily call it a seminary, really, because it's not expected that it's like a lifetime place. You know, like we have this idea in the Western tradition that you enter a monastery and that's it, they throw away the key kind of thing.
Right.
No, in Japan, you're looking at, it could be as short as a year, or, you know, up to maybe 3, 4, possibly 5 years. And you're right, it can be pretty intense. It's designed for young guys who are of that sort of Navy SEAL age, you know, sort of probably 19 to about 23, 24. So they're full of juice, you know, they got all sorts of things going on. And it's sort of like their one opportunity in life to get a bit of, I suppose you could say, kind of condensed spirituality before they head back to the village temple to help dad out or to take over from dad. So, yeah, it tends to be boot camp style. And yeah, I think it's a fair parallel to something like, a military style training. Yeah.
What's the longest you've ever sat silently?
In one sitting?
Yeah.
I've certainly sat all morning, 3-4 hours, something like that. There's something that can happen after a certain point. It's almost like, I don't know, it sort of takes on a life of its own. It can be a bit uncomfortable, but I've personally done quite a bit of sort of body work type stuff along through the years and so on to help to sort of open things up. And then I don't know, it's kind of like things can take on a sort of a life of their own, and it's closer to surfing. I'm not a big believer in, you've got to suffer your way to enlightenment, really. I mean, it's been done, and certainly, there are ways of doing that, but by and large, I don't think they're that productive and that successful. And certainly in the Western world, I'm dealing with people who have made some considerable effort to come and practice. So they've got a motivation, they've got an intention, they really want to do this. Very likely they've experienced things in life which are, as it were, calling for some kind of resolution, some kind of peace. And so we've got tons of motivation there. In a sense, we're up and running. So what we really need to do, as I see it, is do our very best to get the obstacles out of the way. And if that's there, then it actually doesn't take very long to get a first real, as it were, step in the door. And once somebody's got that, it's like, that's it. They can never again be somebody who hasn't done that. It's a game changer.
Are you speaking of a Satori?
Yeah, so they use Satori in Japanese kind of translates as waking up, really, or kind of knowing, I suppose. And then we have Kensho, which is a similar term, which Ken means also to know, and Sho means like who you really are, or your true nature. I personally like the term that the Buddha himself used, which is to enter the stream.
Yes.
And that's his term for sort of, if you like, the first level of enlightenment.
Yes.
And essentially, it's straightforward, because there are only 3 kind of requirements, as it were, to do that. The first one is to see through the kind of optical illusion of me as a solid, separate thing, essentially. I'm not a thing operating in a world of things. I'm much more a process operating in a world of processes. And once I see that clearly enough, that this idea of me as like a pool ball rolling across the table of life becomes just obviously not how it is, then there's that, along with doubt. And the doubt is, I often use the image of it's a little bit like, at probably 7 years old, whatever, you worked out that Santa Claus doesn't exist, and once you've kind of worked that out, once you've got it, that's it for life. You don't need to keep reminding yourself that Santa Claus doesn't exist. Doesn't matter how many Christmas cards you get with big jolly guys on, whatever, you've got it. You know that Santa Claus doesn't exist for life. And it's kind of like that. And then the third thing is you're not relying on rites, rituals, and righteousness. There's no magic, there's no ceremony, there's no ritual or anything that's going to do this. It's basically a matter of clarity, just seeing things clearly enough. And that, dealing with those 3 is not that hard to do. But once we've got that, once we've even entered the stream at that level, the old texts say that the rest will unfold. It's just a matter of time at that point. So although it's not that hard to do, it's a game changer. It completely puts life onto a different course.
Often we hear of the sudden enlightenment concept versus the gradual enlightenment concept.
Yeah.
Would you be able to shine some light on those two?
Well, you know, I think it's a little bit of a red herring, but not entirely. So, in terms of, you know, that first thing, that entering the stream, you know, there is very definitely, in my experience and the way I sort of work with people, there's a moment where I was blind, but now I see, as it were. They get it. Boom. There's a moment. But bear in mind what we just said. You know, what they've dealt with is that sense of me as a solid thing, the doubt about that, and this rites and rituals business. There's still a ton of other issues and stuff. We could still be a fairly nasty, flawed human being and genuinely have done that, you know? And so subsequent to that, and as it were, in terms of the Buddha's layout of things, there are other layers of awakening, dealing with things like what we could call the push-pulls, the forces of attraction and aversion within reality, and particularly the immediate stuff after that first awakening, dealing with that. The attraction is essentially a sense of inadequacy. That sense of I need this sports car or watch or whatever it is, this particular thing, that sense of lack. And then on the other hand, the sense of aversion. Dealing with that stuff, particularly that first phase after that awakening, often does seem to be a gradual process. People kind of sort of whittle away at those forces, as it were. They gradually regain their freedom. And so I think you can sort of authentically really talk about both as being, you know, different dimensions or as it were, different sort of points along the way.
You know, I hear stories of, you know, someone who's been practicing and then all of a sudden they hear like a loud noise and it just snaps them into that quote unquote sudden enlightenment. Like, what's that about? Is it just you get pushed right into the stream?
Yeah. One of the old images that's used in, you know, way back is if you imagine you've got a river, okay, and beside the river there's a tree and there's a rope hanging from the branch. So you're holding on to the rope, okay, and you push out and you swing out over the river, and you push out and you swing out over the river. And there's an effort there, you know, I'll hold on to the rope and then just let go of it again. You're still going to be on the same bank. So you get a bit of momentum going. You start pushing out and pushing out and pushing out. And then, all being well, at a certain point, you let go, and there you are on the opposite bank. And so through the effort of practice, which is like the pushing out of the swinging over the river, as it were, we create a potential. We create a possibility. Sometimes people kind of wander about for a little while in that sort of state of almost like spiritual pregnancy. Sometimes call it the great stupidity. It's like you kind of have come to the end of the road in terms of your reasoning your way through things. You kind of hit a wall. It's almost like you're a bomb waiting to go off, and then it's almost anything. You just walk around a corner and there's a rose, or I don't know, somebody drops a saucepan, or it could be anything at all.
Yes,
A bird flies by and poof, there it is.
Yeah.
But it's not that hasn't caused it. You've caused it in a sense. You've set up the potential,
right?
And then it's just letting go of the rope, as it were.
Right. So it's the gradual practice that leads to the sudden enlightenment.
Yeah, in a sense, it sets up that potential, sets you up for that moment. We don't make that happen. We can't make that happen, but we can set up the conditions.
Earlier that you said it's fairly easy to get to that stream.
Yeah.
How, I mean, it's going to be different for everyone, but on average, how long would it take for someone who's really disciplined to get that glimpse?
Well, we run a 64-hour retreat, which is kind of like a long weekend, which is totally geared towards one and only intention, doing this, entering the stream, as it were. We expect to get roughly 60% of people who come on that, even if they haven't practiced before, will get it. And then most of the rest of the guys, if they come on another one, will tend to get it. Mm-hmm. So basically, it's the entire, time is dedicated towards this one intention. And people kind of go through a lot in that time. One of the things about it is that there are no shortcuts in this business. Yeah. So if you're going to accelerate things like that, it's going to mean almost certainly the path gets pretty bumpy. Okay, so we've got a very structured environment so people can kind of know that they're safe within that to go through the bumps. But it's absolutely a doable thing within really quite a short time. If you look back at the old texts, tons of people were doing it just while they're having a talk with the Buddha. Just sat there, 15 minutes, boof, loads of people. So, we view 64 hours as a bit slow coach, really. But we managed to get hundreds of people every year do that, and find that. And then they've got it. And once they've got it, as I say, it's not the end of the story. There's still lots of refinement to be done. But nevertheless, it's a little bit like I often say, like here in London, you can get a train to Paris. It takes a couple hours. And of course, once you've been to Paris, even if it's only a day trip, you can never again be somebody who hasn't been to Paris. That's it. You're done. So of course it's a different matter moving to Paris or whatever, but nevertheless, Paris, that's it.
When someone goes through this process, I just use the term, detox. There's you said the bumps in the road. I heard I just recently had a woman on my podcast who went through something similar, and she used an interesting term that I'd never heard before. She said spiritual warfare. She said she went through spiritual warfare and a lot happened to cross that bridge, so to speak.
I like that term detox for sure. Yes, and it's very much like that, I think. A lot of stuff clears, a lot of, life issues and Lord knows what else. And of course, none of that stuff can get dealt with in the abstract. It's only as it arises and we slog through it that actually the resolution kind of happens. So it can be kind of bumpy for sure. But I think a detox process is probably the most accurate way of characterizing it.
Do some people get scared during this process?
I think everybody does, really. Everybody at certain points. And, we've got a very, very tight structure. And that really helps a lot, And I sort of talk people through the steps along the way. And fear is, plain old fear is actually pretty easy to deal with, really. When it gets a bit squirrely, a bit tricky, is when it's kind of veiled fear. It's like somebody, for example, gets the idea, there's not enough vitamin B in this diet, they're going to make us sick, this is wrong, or I don't know, this person who snores in my room, how can I possibly achieve any kind of awakening with this woman making this noise? Or it's just something that's just enough to get somebody in their car and over the hill. You know what I mean? And that kind of, if you like, veiled fear can be a little bit trickier to deal with. So I flag it up, because once you're aware of it, then it's no problem. It's only when it's at least partially unconscious that it nabs us. And actually, we have very few people run away, very few. And I tend to trowel it on how rough it can get, and really sort of, So, and then of course they go through it, and it ain't that bad, and they feel like, okay, done, it's good, and they get it. So I think if you set up the conditions right, it's a doable thing.
Have you seen folks go through this, have success with this process sitting in a chair more so than sitting in lotus position?
Well, we put quite a bit of emphasis in physical alignment, as you know, in Zen generally. But actually, that's mostly from the sitting bones upwards, the pelvic alignment and the spinal alignment and all of that. All of that's vastly more important than the legs. The first real proper, Zen master who came over from Japan and taught in America in a kind of a sustained way, a teacher called Suke and Sasaki. He had everybody sit in chairs right the way through, beginning to end. Good teacher, did some real good stuff.
Right in chairs.
He had everybody on chairs, yeah. So I like to give people a choice, so that they can sit on the floor if that's more comfortable, but they can also do it on chairs. Yeah.
As long as the spine is straight.
The upper body alignment, that sort of openness of upper body, really helps. That's not even essential. I often say to people, you're going to do most likely your most profound meditation on your deathbed, when your posture is going to be shot to hell, probably.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it helps. It definitely helps, because when we have a sort of an aligned, balanced physicality, that tends to help a sort of aligned, balanced mind. The body and the mind are so associated. But we've had people who are hunchbacks do it. People in wheelchairs, people who are in various states of physical disrepair. So it's helpful, but it's not essential.
Yeah, I feel more comfortable in a chair for sure.
Yeah.
How important is it to you that you help people get into the stream?
Well, I've been doing this for ages, really. I lived in Zen monasteries for about 20 years, and, I don't know that I'm good for anything else, really. I'm a bit of a one-trick pony. So it is a contribution I can make. So it's not the only thing I do, but we tend to do 6 of those retreats a year in Europe, and we normally do one in the United States and probably 1 or 2 elsewhere. And then we do some longer retreats as well. But I do other stuff too. I train people to be Zen yoga teachers, and we also have a program where we train people to be professional meditation and mindfulness teachers as well. And I set up those programs really for people who wanted to make this kind of work the center of their life, and as it were, have some means of making a living that was in alignment with that kind of intention. So we've got about 300 yoga teachers out there, roughly, about 300 Zen mindfulness meditation teachers.
Okay.
Yeah, various parts of the world.
I'm going to have to look into that. And they don't have to become a Zen master. They don't have to go live in a monastery.
We have a separate program for people who want to do that, who want to become, as it were, Zen teachers. But no, it's we don't have any sort of requirements around, a particular worldview or belief system. I suppose, if anything, what we ask people to be open to is the possibility of change, that change, this principle of change, might just be underlying everything. And I think based on that, we can go all the distance we need to go, really.
Yeah, because I think it's important for people to understand that they don't have to be a monk to reach enlightenment. You could be a regular guy who gets up and goes to work.
Yeah, if you ever have the slightest doubt about that, just spend, a few days in a monastery. It's just a great big soap opera right there. They all are. At least every one that I've ever had anything to do with. So yeah, people are people wherever, It's like the length of people's haircut has very little to do with the sort of things you're talking about, really.
Yeah, in 2012, I went to an ashram, and I was very early on in my journey, and I met a man who I could tell was different. And so I later found out that he was a mystic, And he ended up becoming my mentor for 7 years.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
every time I would get excited and say, let me help you, let me help promote you. Let's start let's start a YouTube channel, let's start a Facebook. He would say, no, no, no. He always shied away from it.
Mm,
And he just, for whatever reason, didn't have the determination to share it unless somebody asked,
mm.
which was me. I was asking.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how, through my journey, I realized that some enlightened folk want to share it, and some just escape to the Himalayan mountains and to be alone.
Mhm.
And I just find it an interesting dynamic of what some people do with this amazing discovery, maybe is a good word. What is that with the people that just want to sort of escape and be alone with their enlightenment and,
Mm.
not
Mm.
become a teacher?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? So when we look back at the sort of archetypical story of the Buddha himself, sat under the tree, he does his practice, he gets his understanding, he spends some time kind of really settling into that, maturing that, and then a kind of a debate arises within him. There's one part of him that's kind of like, well, why don't I just enjoy? Why don't I just do this? And
Yeah.
then there's the other part that's saying, well, maybe you can actually help some people, and it's a, takes a while, but eventually he gets up on his feet and basically spends the next 40 odd years tramping the roads in northern India. So that was his choice. But certainly, I think there are lots of levels really, and maybe people like your mentor there, they can help the world on other dimensions and other ways. Maybe there's other sort of how can we say, other calls perhaps, and it's an uncomfortable area, really, I suppose. There's no kind of settled place. There's no stopping place. Myself, what I try to do is, where I've come to with it is, I think with our stuff, we want to be sufficiently visible that anybody who kind of resonates can find us and know more. That's it. That's it. So we don't want to be, on the 6 o'clock show, be a nightmare. Personally, I can't imagine a worse nightmare than just being, as it were, a face sort of thing. You know what I mean? Like one of those poor people who can, I don't know, maybe a Hollywood person or something, they can never again walk into a cafe or a shop or whatever
Yeah,
without being marked. I mean, that's like,
anonymity is gone.
that's, to me, being an anonymous blob is one of the glories of life. It's like, that's one of the beauties of living in London, really. It's pretty easy to just meld in.
Yeah. How do you become the master of every situation?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So this is a nice question. Master Rinzai had this sort of saying, and he's one of the sort of foundational teachers of one of the key sort of Zen lineages. And his basic take on it is, you become a master of every situation by becoming a master of yourself.
Mm.
You become a master of yourself by, as it were, finding the alignment in which you and, if you like, the universe or every situation are not, as it were, me and the situation, but rather me and the universe, or me and the situation, moment by moment, arising together. So it's not me against the world anymore. It's like this together, this arising, moment by moment. And, with a little bit of practice, we can find our way into that. And then, we we can, there are more or less testing sort of situations in which we can start to explore how it might be. A great tester is being around members of your family. That's advanced practice.
Yes, yes. Because who can push your buttons more than mom or dad or brother or sister?
Totally. Yeah. If you ever start thinking you're the master of every situation, go and see your mum.
Yes, yes. You're on point. Yes. How come I don't hear the term Zen Master much anymore? Is that a term that's fading away, or is that more of an Asian term in the Zen tradition?
If somebody's sort of, it's one of those things where it's kind of bad form to sort of, self-proclaim yourself, whatever,
Right.
So people typically wouldn't use it of themselves. Their students might well. And to be honest, I'm not terribly au fait with how people do all that sort of thing. Mostly, I try to have people just call me Daizan, really, because, it's, I don't think that the titles and all that mean an awful lot. Unfortunately, in this world, there are people, like your mentor, who are probably, some of the finest human beings that humanity's ever produced, who would run a mile to avoid any kind of title. And then there are other people who rather glory in that sort of thing, who have probably got a little bit further to go down the road. So
I'm reminded of his emails, and he never even capitalized the first letter of his name.
is that right? Yeah.
I never asked. I just noticed. How important would you say Master Bhodhidarma is to this whole culture? Because obviously, we always talk about the Buddha himself, but Bodhidharma doesn't come up as much as Buddha. Could you shine some light on how important his work was?
Well, he's a kind of an interesting person. I suppose perhaps in parallel to the Buddha, in that we have, I suppose, a kind of a blend of the historical and the kind of folkloric or the mythological, perhaps. So, for example, they have this story in Asia that Bodhidharma was up in this cave, which is still there, up above the Shaolin monastery on Songshan, China. And he's kind of having this 9-year retreat. And like everybody probably, who at some point, at least on a long retreat, he's getting kind of sleepy, and he tears off his eyelids, and throws them on the ground. And these eyelids eventually sprout and become the first tea bushes. Now, in terms of figurative language, tea is certainly a pretty good way when you're getting a bit sleepy in your meditation.
Right.
I kind of doubt anybody has a lot of credence around that as a historical possibility. Now, certainly at that time, at the sort of period that we can place him, there was a sort of an influx of Buddhist texts and Buddhist people into China, and a lot of interest within China around Buddhism. And he headed for, it seems, for the Shaolin monastery, which is right in the center. China has, as you probably know, everything is in fives in China. Chinese culture loves fives. And you have the 5 sacred mountains of China, the central one, the north, the south, east, and west, basically. And Songshan, where Shaolin is the central mountain. So in a way, he sort of goes to the center. Again, it's probably possibly a kind of a mythological move. But also, at that time, the Shaolin monastery was a kind of a pretty major intellectual and translation center. So there would have probably been quite a lot of people around who would have been familiar with the Indic languages. It might have been a place where he'd have got some kind of, foothold in the kind of common, understanding and linguistic basis. of the area. And then, we have these stories about him doing this retreat and then coming back down the mountain to the monastery and looking around at, I suppose, these rather scholarly kind of guys who are there, and introducing the kind of dimension of, a mindful movement work, essentially, to them as a way of preparing body and mind for more intensive kind of retreat work. Now, that could have been him. It could have not been him. It seems most likely that he came from, the old stories talk about him coming from a royal family of the southern part of India, probably a small state. So almost certainly he would have been from the Kshatriya caste, which means the sort of the warrior caste. So he would have probably had some background in physical cultivation, very likely martial cultivation. So he could well have adapted some of those things to what he found that in the local conditions there. And the Shaolin guys, even to this day, they have a kind of a yoga style practice they call Tongzhigong, which means it literally translates as something like child skills. The idea being that you're kind of working to, as it were, rejuvenate the body. So it's got the kind of the fluidity, the flexibility of a child, and this provides the basis for the more martial type work. But also, just the last few years, they've managed to rebuild a meditation hall there. For many years, they didn't have one. And that dimension of practice is becoming much more highlighted at Shaolin. And so we might be seeing over the next few years a kind of a little bit of rebalancing of how things go there. And they would, very much claim Bhodhidarma as the source of all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So perhaps we could view Bhodhidarma as the inroads of the practicality of spiritual cultivation, as opposed to the intellectual study of spiritual cultivation, as being, whether it was him, whether it was a kind of a movement of various guys. Clearly, there arose this kind of applied, spiritual practice within a Chinese format that, very largely happened within the Zen school, happened with other schools as well. The Tentai school, or as they call it in Japanese, the Tendai school, also very, very important in that. But the Zen school, very, very instrumental, certainly.
Yeah, because it seems, Gautama the Buddha himself, 40 plus years career, so many teachings, just so many sutras. It's a lot. It's a really lot to wrap your head around. And then it seems about 1,000 years later, Bodhidharma comes around and just simplifies it. And just this new tradition starts, it seems.
Yeah, it seems. We do have some teachings, it seems, of Bodhidharma, but they're kind of sparse. You're looking at, 40 pages of material possibly, and a lot of that's contested. So absolutely. Maybe, he was dealing with people who were drowning in the texts. They were just overwhelmed by this, tidal wave of material arriving from India. And perhaps he was part of as you say, a kind of a simplification movement, a back to basics kind of approach.
And then about 500 years after Bodhidharma comes Master Dogen, who writes a lot.
Right, yeah. Spiritual genius, yeah, very much so. Died at 52, I think. He did it all in half a century. He really did a lot. Yeah. Very, very clever. Very good at Chinese. Very, and he came from a Japanese noble background, so very highly educated within both Japanese culture and Chinese culture, and then also had this very applied approach. He was very keen on, people really putting in the hours in the sitting and so on. So yeah, very important person.
Yeah, I find that period to be very beautiful because at the same time you had Dogen doing his thing. Jalaluddin Rumi was doing his thing in the Middle
Mm.
East with the
Yeah.
Sufi tradition, and they were doing it at the same time in different places.
Yeah, we had Meister Eckhart in Europe, I think almost the same time.
Yes, Meister
Very
Eckhart.
similar kind of approach. Yeah, exciting time. I mean, it was very wild as well. You know, in Japan at that period, they thought the end of the world was coming. You know, people really had a sort of a very intense kind of spiritual quest going on. And of course, you had the Mongols, you know, creating the biggest landmass empire there's ever been, and you know, devastating people. Rumi had encounters, I think, with the Mongols or branches of the Mongols in the far west of their empire there. And Japan had a couple of invasions which didn't quite happen, you know, but the Mongols actually got a foothold on Japan for a little bit. And certainly in China, it was, you know, it was very, very devastating.
A lot of
So there
blood.
was this real feel that it was almost like end times. People really wanted some you know, some spiritual underpinning for their lives.
Now, all right, let's go back to about 500 BC, back to the Buddha's time. There was another gentleman doing it at the same time named Lao Tzu. And many people say that Lao Tzu is half of Zen.
Uh-huh.
How would you receive that? Half Buddha,
Yeah.
half Lao Tzu.
Well, I think in terms of the koans, like you started with the one-hand koan. There's actually a whole kind of like syllabus of koans in certain schools of practice. And there's a massively strong influence in many of them, not so much from Lao Tzu, but from the second major guy of Taoism, Zhuang Tzu. I don't know if you've ever come across him.
Yes.
He's like, I think he's the only major world philosopher who's laugh out loud funny. He's fantastic, absolutely amazing. And a lot of his insights are particularly around this idea of relativity, I suppose, that nothing's fixed. That, you know, there's this very famous story, for example, of him, you know, falling asleep, having a dream of a butterfly and being a butterfly and fluttering about. And then he wakes up and he just does not know. Is he a butterfly dreaming that he's Zhuang Tzu? Is he Zhuang Tzu dreaming that he's a butterfly? And he constantly plays with, you know, different, essentially this principle of relativity. And Zen has absorbed that in a big way. Yeah, that's a huge influence. Lao Tzu himself, you get odd quotes kind of thing, like, for example, you know, the person of the world gains something every day. The person of the world, the person of the way loses something every day, which is kind of a nice one, isn't it? Stuff like that. Yeah, there's a sort of a diffused influence, I would say, with Lao Tzu himself. But Chuanzi, it's absolutely there, absolutely very clear. Yeah. So it never became like a possession of Taoism. The whole sort of I Ching thing, and the I Ching is very influential in Zen for sure. They use the imagery quite a lot from the I Ching. I mean, the I Ching means the classic of changes, if you like. It's the book that tracks the flow of change through reality, and Zen's all about that. You know, so it's you know, it's a very, very handy kind of local source for that sort of you know, for imagery around living in that flow of change, living in the stream, if you like.
Speaking of the stream, I heard you mention in a YouTube video that gratitude is the first sign of enlightenment.
That's what my first Zen teacher used to say to us. Yeah. Every moment, every blink of an eye, every single thing is a gift. It's absolutely, we live in the presence of gifts at any one moment. And as we learn to let go. You know, essentially, I would say, if we were going to give Zen another term, we would call it letting goism, maybe.
Yeah.
As we learn to let go, we inevitably learn to let come, because nature abhors a vacuum. And so that letting come dimension is the dimension of receiving, the dimension of, essentially, the dimension of gratitude.
Mm.
And so we move from a, if you like, an orientation or a worldview or a reality in which it's, you know, we're stuck, we're fixed, we're, as it were, behind walls, to, again, we're back to the stream again, where we're, as it were, giving, we're letting go, we're releasing our sort of control, and moment by moment we're receiving endlessly. And so what can we do but bow?
Yeah. I know a young lady, a lovely young lady, who she told me just recently that close to once a day, she just gets an overwhelming feeling of happiness and she starts to cry. And she says it can happen while she's driving. It could happen on a walk. And she says it happens all the time, just this flood of overwhelming joy. And she just cries. And that's gratitude, right?
Yeah.
That's the power of gratitude.
Yeah.
So she's got something there to work with.
Sounds like she's doing great, eh?
So let's talk about a term. It's my favorite term. I mean, most enlightenment has become sort of watered down. In other words, many people use it as slang, right? They could be having a debate and they say, all right, enlighten me, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's using the word completely different than it is, you know, in Zen. The term that I feel is the most appropriate would be self-realization. But the term that I learned in Zen was the original face.
Mm-hmm.
Can you shine some light on that term? What is the original face before my parents?
Yeah. Well, it goes back to a beautiful teacher called Eno. Again, he's possibly a little bit of folklore figure, but he's probably a little bit more historical than Bhodhidarma. So he was just, like a very, very low-level guy, making a living just cutting firewood and selling it up on the hills, and perhaps kind of practicing in a sort of a spontaneous, untutored, natural way. So he comes down into the town one time with a bundle of firewood, and he just happens to hear somebody chanting a sutra, a text, and boom, he gets it. And so he can't read, he can't write. He's from the way down south of China. Back in the day, they didn't even consider them proper Chinese. Mm-hmm. But here he is, this outsider. He's got it. And with no sort of practice background, nothing. So anyway, he makes his way up to the fifth ancestor of Zen, and who recognizes that he's maybe a little bit like your teacher, he's unassuming, he's not particularly trying to fly his own kite, but there's something really amazing going on here. And so anyway, the fifth ancestor, he's a lay person, he's not a monk, so he just kind of has him come in the monastery and work in the kitchen for a while, while he can keep an eye on him. And he's pretty impressed with what he's seeing. So eventually, he decides this is his successor. This is going to be the guy he wants to, as it were, pass on the baton to. Mm. And so he does in the middle of the night, but then very aware that this is going to cause a scandal because this guy is not in the ranking. He's illiterate. He's a southerner. He's sort of, he's completely out of the sort of regular run of things. So anyway, the fifth ancestor has this guy kind of disappear off, You know, he passes it on to him at midnight, and then off he goes. And so Enno has got the robe. He's been given the robe as kind of like proof of his succession. Okay, and he's disappearing off into the hills. And, you know, the guys back at the monastery are outraged when they find out about this. And there's probably all kinds of, you know, the fifth ancestors, he's going senile, he's lost the plot, you know, something's gone wrong here. Anyway, a posse ends up chasing Enno into the hills. He's you know, he's basically a fugitive. He's a wanted man. And so, you know, they're disappearing off into this. And eventually, you know, I guess the pursuers gradually drop off. Perhaps they're not so fit. But the last guy is this character called Myo, who's ex-military. So he's probably in pretty decent shape. Okay. And he manages to catch up with Enno. Enno realizes, you know, his number's up. So he just puts the robe on a rock and he just goes and hides behind a tree sort of thing. Myo kind of puffs up the hill, there it is, and he goes to reach, and he can't either, you know, the way it's expressed in the old text is he can't actually pick it up, a little bit like King Arthur and the sword or something, I suppose. But, you know, maybe he's just a little bit in awe or whatever. And then Enno steps out from behind the tree and says, you know, what's this pursuit about? Have you come for a bit of cloth, or have you come for the truth? And Myo says, well, actually, I've come for the truth. And you've got Enno facing Myo. And Enno says to him, well, right now, this moment right now, what is the true face of Myo before his parents were born? What is this? It's not a thought. It's not a memory. It's not your body. It's not a feeling. What is it? What is this true face? Who are you really?
The original face.
And facing each other. The old text says that Myo kind of broke out in a kind of a sweat, and he got it there and then. He said, I know my original face. You've shown me. Now you're my teacher. And Enno says, no. You go back to the temple now. Carry on, you know. But nevertheless, just encountering each other in this, not any one thing you can put your hand on, and yet here we are. And this here we are is actually beginningless and endless.
Yeah.
It's before your parents were born. And on this level, you will never die.
What's so revealing about this concept is it makes the student understand also that they don't even belong to their parents. They were just born into that situation at a physical form level.
Right. 100%. Yeah.
That's a lot for someone to digest the first time it happens.
But here we are.
What a conversation. I mean, we started with one hand clapping and we end it with the original face. What better way, right? Yeah, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Nice to talk.
And if you want to get familiar with Daizan's work, you can go to zenways.org and check out the website. What a conversation, huh? We actually kept talking, and I do have that audio and video available And maybe I'll put it on my new Patreon page. If you'd like to see it, direct message me. Email me. I'm not hard to find. Let me know if you want to hear more Daizan. For now, be sure to check my work at drreese.com. That's doctor spelled out. And I'll talk to you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Inner Peace with Dr. Reese. If this episode opened your heart, feel free to share on social media and tell your loved ones. Also, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, may peace be with you.